I'm here with Pam Warhurst, the founder and chair of Incredible Edible. Pam is a CVE and has been an activist and advisor for over 40 years, occupying a front row seat on how government operates and invests at all levels. At Incredible Edible, she's currently spearheading the Right to Grow campaign, advocating to repurpose underused public spaces into vegetable gardens and orchids. On screen, we'll have joining us Carlos Moreno, who is Associate Professor and Scientific Director, Entrepreneurship, Territory Innovation at the Pantheon Sorbonne University, and Love Sega, who's a songwriter, musician, and artist. His music has been played at the Sydney Opera House, to a full-scale climate-focused commission, and other performances, including the National Gallery in London. He was also the original frontman of Clean Bandit, and is now a trustee of the Brian Eno-led environmental charity Earth Percent. So thank you for joining us, Professor Moreno and Sega. So first question for Pam. You've talked about how cities are really collections of neighborhoods. Can you say a bit about that and talk about how growing food to be consumed locally transforms life for people, and especially young people in the neighborhoods where Incredible Edible is working?
Sure, I'd love to, and I'm sorry I was a little late.
Okay.
I'm pretty good on some neighbourhoods, obviously London neighbourhood I'm not. But anyway, yeah, it seems to me that when we are thinking about climate change and we're thinking about the need to think about behaviour shift and all the other things that we know are part of the solution to living within planetary constraints, we have to operate at the human scale. And the human scale doesn't necessarily operate at a city level. It operates at a neighbourhood level. It operates at on the level of the streets you're accustomed to, the places you take your kids. So if we see a city as a complex relationship between neighbourhoods, we see the possibility of humans relating to those neighbourhoods, and our experience of Incredible Edible is that actually the people who transform neighbourhoods through their passion and their gifts should have seats around the table when we're talking about climate change. So what happens in the neighbourhoods that we work in, 150 across the UK, borough level, village level, you name it, and all over the world, is they transform streets from unloved places to edible gardens that people can share the food from. And sharing the food is part of the journey to reconnecting with your community. And through that process of growing and making horrible little corners, dog toilets, place that people threw their litter, whatever it was, by making them wonderful at your own scale, with your own resources, you are contributing to being part of a solution to greening up our planet. And what we've seen is that when people actually do that, whether it's in front of their hospital or it's on their grass verges, or sometimes it's in their unused cemeteries, it doesn't really matter, then we start to see people reshaping place and space in a green way that they don't need permission to do. And that at the same time as reshaping it, they start to think about their behaviour towards that place. They start to learn new skills around soil. They start to have conversations with complete strangers and learn new gifts. They start to think about if they're going to grow their own food, wouldn't it be great if we had more local markets? And through that thought process, year in, year out, they start to reshape what the place they call home looks like. And all they've done is think about local food and grown it locally. And at scale, that would mean that we stop thinking about food on urban fringes and start thinking about it right in the centre. And because we need to inspire the next generation, who are absolutely cheesed off with the lack of activity that's going on in terms of world leadership, we start to inspire the technicians and the architects and the engineers who can rethink the model about how we can produce 40% more of our fruit and vegetables from our urban centres, which is a possibility. And all that's happened is that ordinary folks have got up in the morning and thought, what shall I do about my neighbourhood, my people, making sure there's food availability? Well, I'll tell you what, I'll stop moaning about it and I'll go out and I'll grow food and share. And that's how communities reshape neighbourhoods and inspire others to think about redesigning for a future planet.
That's awesome. You can clap if you want. That's really good.
Thank you.
A question for Professor Moreno. You're known for many things, but one of them is the 15-minute city. So can you define briefly the 15-minute city and give an example of cities and neighborhoods where you see this concept coming to life most vividly.
Of course, thank you. Thank you for your kind invitation. Greetings from Paris. It's a real pleasure, it's an honor to be with you today. The 50-minute city is a concept for defining another lifestyles in the hard times of the climate change and recently with the pandemic crisis. The 50-minute city, it's a new way for transforming our traditional lifestyle based on cities specialized with the historical center, corporate districts, cultural districts, different areas for living with different incomes. We want to promote another definition of the quality of life. And for that, we have defining this polycentric city. This is a city where we have the possibility to access to a lot of different services for accessing with less CO2 emissions, to live with the organic materials and human scale districts, to supply, this second point, to having shorter circuits for local shops, local jobs, local activities for creating added value, to access to medical services, mental and physical health in proximity with the first possibilities for having this relevant services, in particular in these times of pandemic. The fourth point, to access to education, culture, theaters, a lot of intellectual activities, and to access to rediscover public spaces, to enjoy in streets, to enjoy in squares, to have public spaces for kids, for women in safety conditions, for developing democracy, for developing a lot of activities for human and not for cars. The 50-minute city is not a magic wand for transforming a lot of decades of the traditional urbanism based on long distances and long commute. We need for that transform our mindset of the local governance for proposing this polycentric city with a lot of different services. This is a new vision of the urbanism based on the urbanism with a lot of services, not based on more and more infrastructures for continuing to go further and faster. We need to reuse a lot of infrastructure that existed today. We have three rules. The first one, change the pace of the city, change differently for reducing the long daily commute, 1 hour, 2 hours, more for a round trip. The second rule is to develop the multi-purpose functions in infrastructure that existed today, because the essential of buildings today are used only for one functions, and as a result, this very low rate of uses of buildings. And the third rule is to develop the topophilia, more and more human activities in the public space, loving different our neighborhood, using art, culture, music, theater, social links, social activities, solidarity, and the most important, otherness, because we need to fight against racism, populism. We need to develop this necessary way to develop a more social, humanistic activities. The 50-minute city,
Yeah.
this is a ecologic and humanistic way for having better lifestyles in our cities.
Thank you, Professor Moreno. I actually think that that connects very much to Sega's work. Sega, I thought maybe you could talk about how you use music to bring awareness to issues such as air pollution advocacy, and in particular, can you talk a little bit about your upcoming project with Theaster Gates and David Adjaye?
Oh, so yeah, thank you very much for having me, and to my two other speakers as well. It's great to be on this platform. And like you said, there are so many things listening to Professor Moreno there which tie in terms of what I try to do. Because if you look at the title, where it's creating public spaces to inspire change. I'm from London. It's a shame I can't be with you today because I'm not in London at the moment. But what about the current public spaces which we have, which are already there? So I wanted to quickly just touch upon a project which I had at the National Gallery. And if I have some images that hopefully will pop up seamlessly virtually of the National Gallery. And what I did there is it was, again, an environmentally focused commission. And it was to take different people, different groups. And coming from my perspective as a Black person growing up in London, I wanted to bring an all-Black ensemble cast to the National Gallery. And it's there. We cleared all of the furniture. We changed the framing where, again, we've got, that's Paris Crossley there, who's doing whacking, a different type of dancing. That's Crystal Lowe doing ballet dancing in front of the Turners, the Gainsboroughs, the Constables in room 34. So what we're doing, and it's a different audience there. So that project where it was talking about sustainable social housing. So as we do this green transition, just to make sure that people aren't left behind as part of the green transition. So when we're talking about architecture and we're talking about buildings, we have to remember the people that I mainly speak to, come to my concerts and so on and so forth. They are 18 to 35, so-called generation rent. So if a lot of the stuff, if you're talking about heat pumps, that's to landowners, landlords and landladies. So if you're talking to homeowning people, then you're leaving out 18 to 35-year-olds. So then that's why I was like, okay, if I talk about sustainable social housing, so what are we doing there with our spaces where everyone can have buy-in there? And to make that statement to reflect, and it was great to have, there's so many cultural institutions in our big cities, whether it's art galleries, whether it's museums, whether it's performance spaces, where we can be political about it, we can look to do social change, and we can change the demographics of not just the people performing there, but then the people who are coming in as well. So I haven't gotten to the Fiesta Gates thing, but I just wanted to mention that as well. But again, that's with the Serpentine Gallery, and that's to tie in with my work at air pollution, which I was doing in Lambeth and Southwark, where again trying to bring in community groups to use art and culture as a basis to talk about something which isn't talked about that much, but by 2050, I think 68% of people will be living in cities. And air pollution is a silent killer. We've got World Health Organization guidelines, but then a lot of people who are brown and Black people in cities like your own in New York or in London or in Paris or in other cities across the world, they're facing this and we're overlooking it. So how can you bring something which is quite dry? And I think that's where art and culture and music can make a change. But we don't need to build, I think as both Pam and Carlos were saying, we don't need to build new spaces. We can use the existing spaces and that rich cultural heritage and just make sure that the context reflects the people who are living in these areas.
That's great. Thank you, Sega. You know, Pam, we talked about this. I grew up in a food desert in New York, and so your work is incredibly powerful to me. Can you talk about how access to fresh grown food impacts a person's sense of entitlement and possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, apart from the obvious, which is if you nurture yourself, you're more likely to achieve at the levels that we deem to be important in terms of education or well-being or whatever else it might be. But actually, for me, that's incredibly important. But what is really important is that as we start to take control in our own minds of the unloved spaces of our lives, whether that's in Lambeth or wherever that might be, then we start to realise that we have our own agency and we have our own gifts, and we are part of finding a solution into the future, which, quite frankly, is a rare commodity because people tend to do to people. So what happens, imagine, we've got people who are growing their own food. They live in a place where they've taken up over their spaces. They're redefining what they look like. Actually, on the whole, nobody's ever died from doing that, and most public servants quite like it if you just crack on and do it. So just imagine a 10-year-old starting to live in a place like that, and we've been doing this for 14 years. By the time they're 24, their mindset in terms of what is possible, what places should look like, what skills they actually want to bring forward is completely different than if nobody had ever been doing that. Nobody tried to show that we've got our agency for creating inclusive places that are about good food. And, you know, it's a completely different mindset to that of a young person who's going to a supermarket and back. So actually, once we start to realize our own gifts and our own agency and our self-belief, then we start to nurture a more positive mindset, we start to nurture a more positive health set, and we start to nurture more opportunities for us to impact positively on the environment, not be a lot of whinging victims.
Okay. No whinging victims. Sega, can you talk about entitlement and possibility and how that plays in your work? I mean, clearly when you show those images of all of those people of color in a space like the National Gallery, it's very meaningful. But I know that you've also talked about your work with Slow Factory and how that inspires you. So I was hoping you could touch on that as well.
Yeah, I think it's great. Well, Slow Factory, they're based in New York, and it's a women-led, women of color-led organization, and they're doing a lot in the fashion space. So I was fortunate to have a visual piece as part of their first MoMA PS1 exhibition in the homeroom. And I think what Slow Factory do, and whatever somebody do, I'm a musician, I'm a creative person, but the whole point is to use your platform to then shine light on different people who are doing different things on the ground with grassroots. And Slow Factory as well, they raise indigenous voices and indigenous learnings that have been there for centuries, but have then been overlooked. So I think it's also, as Pam was saying, it's important to bring these different connections together. So if you're part of diaspora, whether you've ended up, your family has come from one part of the world and then ended up in London, or has ended up in Queens, in New York, we have similar learnings where we can take these voices and enter platform them. And I think it's an important thing to do. And similarly, it's finding the different spaces who will then open their doors, will then give the platform for these messages to come through. And yeah, it's great if my art, similarly, if I was doing in Southwark and Lambeth, looking with air pollution, I make sure to then highlight advocacy groups like Choked Up, who are a young group, all women group, non-male group. And yeah, it's important to use my platform, my art, and the attention I can grab to then pass on to the experts, whether it's the architects, whether it's the campaigners, whether it's the legislators doing climate litigation. So I think that's important, but make sure we've got these voices and we're bringing them into the room, even by force, if necessary, in my case.
Yeah. Professor Moreno, I wanted to ask you about the whole idea of bringing different voices to the architects, to the people who are, literally, shaping cities with their work. How do you see that happening? And do you have any examples of how these different voices are being brought into the room and to the table?
Yes, in fact, we need today to transform our cities with a holistic way. We need to transform the local governance. This is the case in Paris with the 50-minute city. The mayor of Paris embraced the 50-minute city before the pandemic crisis. For that, Anne Hidalgo, the mayor, said we need to provoke a big bang of proximities. The first point is to change the local governance for developing more and more decentralization, for developing more accessibility to the public service in the neighborhood, to develop, for example, a more intensive participatory budget for proposing to fund the citizens in order to submit local projects in the neighborhood for transforming concretely our neighborhoods, our streets, our squares. We need to involve as well the private sector. We need to involve the public, the private sector for building differently our city. We need to develop more and more hybridization for having, for example, neighborhood for living, for working, for proposing local activities, for proposing sports activities, for proposing a lot of different activities, and to break this segmentation of the city. We need, of course, to create local jobs. We need to develop employment. We need to develop short circuits. But we need as well to transform the mindset of each one of us, citizens, for example, to buy in the local shops and not buy Amazon of the digital platforms. It's better because when we have decided to go to the local commerce in my street, this is not only for buying, and this is not only for shopping, this is for saying hello. This is for having a different possibility, for discussing with people, for exchanging, for creating social links, for having a concrete activity. I think that with the 15-minute city, we wanted to promote the living city of the Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs said in 16th in North America, the livable city is a city when we have the possibility to meet people when I'm going to the street, when I have the possibility to say hello, when I have the possibility to have a choice every time, everywhere. We needed to break with the constraint of mobility. We need to be aware that for the essential of mobilities in a daily is totally constrained because we don't have a choice. I need to go early from my home to my office during 2-3 hours for a round trip. We need to develop this possibility for have a choice, for giving not only for me, for my children, the new generations, the young people. At the same time, let's not forget that the climate change is our main threat. It's a global threat. This is no more a climate change. This is now a climate emergency. And I need to discuss with young people because with the crisis, we needed to live differently. We no longer have a choice now. We need to develop a sustainable consumption at the same time to develop a better high quality of life. The 50-minute city, this is this double convergence. Yeah. Less mobilities constraint and more quality of life in the neighborhoods.
Thank you, Professor Moreno. I want to open up to questions. I hope people have questions for our guests, but before we do, I just want to ask a lightning round question. You know, when I read that this panel was going to be about cities, I thought a lot about the work of one of my favorite writers. I'm so happy you brought up Jane Jacobs. And I thought about Witold Rybinski and his book, The Most Beautiful House in the World. So I wanted to ask each of our panelists if they could tell us their own personal definition of the most beautiful house in the world and why they think it's so. So Professor Moreno, do you want to start?
Yes, of course. I prepared this picture.
And what are we looking at?
Yeah. I'm not sure if do you have a...
Yeah, we can see.
We got it.
We got it.
Okay. This picture is a particular picture because I was born in Colombia. And I left Colombia when I was 20 years old. But this picture, this is a traditional village is the Indian Arawaks in the north of Colombia, in South America. And this is beautiful, beautiful house, but this is not only a beautiful house. This is a beautiful village, because at the same time, this is the traditional village with the organic materials, with the natural aeration, with the natural lighting, with the medical local services based on traditional ways of Indians. This is the intergenerational activities. And this is a northern lifestyle based on the more harmonious, peaceful, and strong interaction of the nature. I need to learn today several lessons of these Indians in South America and the other places.
Thank you, Professor Moreno. I'm from Panama, so somos vecinos. I didn't know you were from Colombia. So, Pam, I wanted to ask you the same question, and then Sega. Pam, what's the most beautiful house in the world to you?
Well, that was a bit tricky till about 2 minutes ago, and then I just thought of something.
Right.
Which is actually, it's not quite answering the question, but I never quite do. It's the most beautiful non-house that I've ever been to. Some time ago, about, I don't know, 10 years ago, when we first started creating propaganda gardens, growing food, sharing, and all the rest of it, we'd had the earthquake in New Zealand, and the folks from Christchurch came over. Not because we're the best people who grow cabbages, but we were actually demonstrating that there's a lot you can do without a lot when it comes to feeding people. And they came over and they watched what we did, and then they went back. And then 5 years later, they invited me to come and speak in Christchurch. And I was taken to this city that lost 80% of its revenues because 80% of it fell. So it was stony broke. So it had no money to do anything at all. What did they do? They cleared what were the buildings to create the vacant lots, to put art, community art, by the people, for the people in it, and to grow food by the people, for the people in it. And these wonderful non-buildings were full of smiling people, bringing back hope into a bankrupt city. That's the most impressive non-building I've ever been to.
I like it. Thank you. Sega, can you finish us out and tell us what the most beautiful house in the world is to you? Oh, no, you're muted.
Sorry. I've done so well up until
It was almost a game of charades.
Take a leaf out. Yeah, I was going to take a leaf out to Professor Moreno's book. And this building, if you can see it, that's a place in Uganda called Namutamba.
Nice.
And that's an old tea plantation, and it's a very simple house. And that belonged to my dad's cousin's family. And similarly, in Uganda, you've got different intergenerational households and the like. And families, children get passed around. So when my grandparents came to the UK, my dad went there, went to the 7, and then he went to the little primary school there with his cousin, then ran around. And then when my dad passed away, my uncle then took me there and then showed me around. And I think the reason why it's beautiful is because it's a very simple house. It's a very simple place. However, it touches on what sort of Pam was alluding to as well. Buildings, I believe, are made by the people, and also with homes, where you've got to have a community around you. You've got to have different age groups. It's not divided between young and old and everything. Everything's divided now. Buildings can bring people together, and it's about providing people with that security of knowing that there is a community, that they can stay there, that the rents aren't going sky high, they're not being gouged out, and they can create that memories that even 40 years later, someone can go back and still feel that aura around it.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Let's take some questions. Thank you to all the panelists. Do people have questions?
Thanks for that. We've spoken a lot about communities, and it makes me wonder what institutions and governments can do to nurture these communities, because obviously it does take some resources and some encouragement.
Do you want to jump in?
Well, I will jump in because I believe that it's about creating a positive mindset, both at community and at state level. Because, as you've just said, we have the gun of climate change to our temples, and it's the trump card of all trump cards. So if that's not going to force people out of their boxes to think about life differently, I don't know whatever is. My experience has been that if you actually do take notice of what is going on at a grassroots level, there are many, many people, citizens all around the world, changing the world for the better themselves without waiting for anybody's permission to do that. They're not doing that because they feel like being naughty. They're doing that because they want to demonstrate an alternative proposition to the policymakers, the anchor institutions, the government or whatever, about what good would look like from their point of view. And I think what we're starting to see now is the very best of those thinkers in state institutions being brave enough to become servant leaders, put down that mantle of, I'm going to devolve power, but it stops at me, and start to engage in a respectful conversation with people at a grassroots. It is starting to happen. And what needs to happen is we need to amplify those positive messages to make those people in government and elsewhere braver, so that they can see that actually collectively the power of what they can do and what the citizens can do together can start to create wonderful places for people to live in, that it's not all about the financial bottom line, but together they can think about the next 5 and 10 years. So I think it's starting to happen already. I think people in institutions are frightened to change, and we need to take the bravest in the bravest institutions, and if it's a 15-minute Paris, which in essence is incredible edible Paris, but I'm just doing food, you're doing it for everything, and really start to talk about that. Because people will listen now in a way that 14 years ago, from my point of view, they wouldn't. Because they didn't really understand that they haven't got the solutions that they thought they had for the tomorrows that's coming.
That's great, thank you. Do we have one more question before we wrap out? Back there.
Hello there. So being from the United States, one of the things I think that kind of comes as an obstacle to community is this inherent socialization towards individualism. Success is individual, failure is individual, growth, loss, all of these things we experience as individuals of our individual doing. And I think that impedes a lot of community development. Everything feels like a zero-sum game. And we're socialized into thinking that way because, we're all endowed by the American dream to pull up ourselves by our bootstraps, but I don't think that really happens. So how do you get over that hump of being socialized into one idea to re-socialize yourself into a different idea that is community-centric, that is rooted in being in bond and in community with the person next to you, and is fundamental to how you exist on a daily basis?
That's a great question. Sega, I was wondering, especially because you're in the arts, there is such a cult of personality around individuals, I think, in the arts. But you've really centered your work in community. Can you talk about that, about the community versus an individual?
Yeah, I think that's I think it's a great question, and I think the individual in the arts, that's a sham, because even with a song, you need a producer, you need musicians, you need different a whole system. You need the venue to make sure that they're the ticketing and everything else. So I think what we need to do with the arts is realizing what's the power of the arts, and the power of the arts is actually bringing people together. And so what I did with my air pollution campaign, first it was in Lewisham, one borough of London, and that was Our World Fight for Air. I made a song, and then I got members of the community to say, do you care about air pollution? Yes, we will be in the video. So then that's something about being clever about the messaging. You then have a music video, which you can then show to people and say, look, here are people of color, here's a cross-section of this community who are doing things. Now, what Pam said earlier, which I thought was a great point, is in terms of not whinging. So the last campaign I did was Live and Breathe, and you can see it at weliveandbreathe.co.uk. And with that, it was going to community groups. So it was BMXers, it was going to dance groups all around Lambeth and Southwark, a much bigger area. And the point is, then the thing that tied them together was some music which I composed, but then also the topic of air pollution, because why we're fighting for air pollution, against air pollution, is the fact that we want to be able to live and breathe, just as Pam is doing. We want to be able to grow our vegetables and everything else without having this toxicity. So then if you can do it with the arts and utilize that power, and to make sure you've got a snazzy 1 minute 40 video, which can then go on TikTok or all the different channels where people consume, then you can push that message of community. And then you actually find, because I was going into schools, I was going to youth clubs, which have been cut. And then you can bring it together and then show people and say, look, here is the community. This is what the community people are doing day in, day out. And then this is how they respond to a topic of air pollution and saying, we want clean air and we're making this call now. And it takes it, and it's all about the community there. So it's how you frame something. That's what art is about, and culture, how you frame something, because we can just change the lens. And that's what we need to do.
That's great. Thank you so much. I thought we have one more question in the back, and then we'll wrap.
Thank you. I'm interested, this kind of links to the previous question. I'm interested in what you were kind of saying about how we reframe people's thinking. And I'm thinking about hope. Do you think that it kind of moves from, I'm interested in whether it moves from people thinking differently to spaces, or whether it's spaces that create the opportunities for people to think differently, because what you were kind of saying in that previous answer, how when people can see the evidence of that community, that's what allows them to have the hope that something can actually like move forward. So not just the proposal of an alternative future, but the evidence of an alternative future. Does that resonate with you? Thanks.
That's great. Okay, since this is our last question, does everyone want to say one sentence about how you see hope in your work and how it's resonating? Do we want to do Professor Moreno, Sega, and then Pam to finish?
Yes, with proximity, we need to create a new sense of belonging, not only in my community, but to be present in the economical, social, and ecological urban fabric. And for that, we resume in this sentence, we need to develop happy proximities for living in a here and now in a better future.
Thank you so much, Professor Moreno. Pam?
I'm just going to cite an example of something that happened, because I think it's an interaction. It's all about people, whatever you are. If you're an architect, if you're a mum coming home from school, it's about realising you have an agency and you can start to do something. And once you start to do that, actually it brings positivity. And from that, you move into, I think, potentially hope. But let me just give you a quick example. So we were creating propaganda gardens, which are kind of guerrilla gardens, but they're not as aggressive. And we'd put some signs there and said, please help yourself. So we did it in some poor areas, and families were walking past them full of food. And of course, because we're Brits, we don't pick them because we think we're going to be shot or sued or something. Anyway, eventually, people do. The kids climb over the walls, they start to pick it. This is on the way back home from a place, from their school, onto one of the estates. One day, we were looking out the window. A family and kids climbed over the wall, picked some vegetables, picked some herbs, never seen them before in our life, disappeared. The next morning, on the doorstep of that house that had the garden to share, was a bowl of soup made from the vegetables and the herbs that were picked in that garden by a complete stranger. That is what community is about, and that is what hope is about. And we didn't trigger that at all, but it always makes me believe that when we, in honesty, try to do something creative, whatever our skill set is, it brings hope.
Thank you. Sega?
Yeah, I think we need hope, and I think hope is there because people are seeing the current system isn't working. So when a lot of these things, I think environmental justice, intersectionality, environmental justice is social justice, is racial justice. So our air pollution, all these other things have been caused by a hunt for fossil fuels, which was linked to imperialism and British Empire and different things. And you can see the fossil fuels, they're running out, and also it's leading us to war. So there is an alternate future. And if we actually look at history and we look at the lifespan, there are so many indigenous communities from across the globe who've managed to live in coexistence with nature and the planet, and they were happy. So I have hope that things are going to move back towards that, because the current system isn't working and people aren't happy. So I think that naturally that's going to happen. So I think we should keep pushing at that door to push positive messages.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panelists for coming, Professor Moreno, Sega, Pam, and thank you all for staying all day.